The Library of Classic American Literature. Every time I talk about literature, people seem to think poetry. People think, I'm not going to say people and generalize it, but some people about that. Some people seem to equate literature with poetry, or they seem to equate good literature with what is considered a bestseller. Let's talk about this for a minute. I think a few years ago, that little girl, I shouldn't call her a little girl, Snooki, I think her name is, Nicole Snooki, from a little show on MTV called The Jersey Shore. She wrote a book. She was on the bestsellers list. Everybody was buying the book. Do I consider that good literature? No, I don't. Good literature has something to do with quality, when the writing is superb, when the sentence patterns are coherent, when the characters being portrayed speak with eloquence, when they are characters with a level of intellect, and when they speak with a vulgar vernacular, when they are perhaps of a lower class. Let's put it that way, and let's perhaps put that into between quotation marks, because what is low class? We could go on and on talking about that. But when I talk about good literature, I am talking about literature that is academically acclaimed. This is my personal perspective. Academically acclaimed, that is the kind of literature that brings you knowledge of things that you wouldn't otherwise learn without reading a particular book. I'm not talking about those romance novels you pick up at the airport. Mary and Kevin fell in love and they had a torrid affair, and then they went to Cuba together for a romantic whatever time, and then all of a sudden Kevin's ex-wife shows up, and I mean, go watch a soap opera. Some people say that any reading is better than no reading at all. I beg to differ. There is a point in life when you have to choose what is good. So let's go on. What is good literature? Literature that brings you knowledge. Literature that is academically acclaimed. A Pulitzer Prize and a Nobel Prize doesn't hurt either. And most of the authors that I will be working with from now all the way throughout the fall, I'll say, everything will be of excellent quality. So right now, I'm working on the picture of Dorian Gray, A Streetcar Named Desire, which is a play. Picture of Dorian Gray is a novel. Streetcar Named Desire is a play. I may or may not include Pride and Prejudice. That would be British literature. So is Oscar Wilde. Tennessee Williams was American. And I am thinking about the Scarlet Letter, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, all compiled here. So there's a lot of good work to be done. Last year, I read most of the books by Toni Morrison, and I did literary analysis on all of those books. I also did a little bit of her biography, talked about her personal life. I watched a lot of documentaries about her. I read a lot about her different biographies. And the other day, somebody was saying, hey, why don't you write a biography on Toni Morrison's life? And I'm thinking, if I were to ever write something of my own about anything related to Toni Morrison, it would be picking themes from her novels and perhaps finding something that I want to create on top of that, or giving my perspective on the themes that she approaches and how she approaches these themes, or talk about the language perhaps, talk about the veracity of the vernacular used by certain characters, because a lot of people would come to my channel and find me reading a book by Toni Morrison, and they would say, "Isn't this woman supposed to have won a Nobel Prize?" She's saying ain't. And I'm trying to explain to these people, when an author puts the words into a character's mouth, the character is speaking. So if I create a character that is an eloquent professor at Harvard University, I'm not going to have the professor say, "Yo, what up? How's it going?" But if I'm writing about a hood rat, a little ghetto boy, perhaps the vernacular would be more acceptable for him to be saying "what up," and perhaps having his pants down that you almost feel like you want to pull their pants up nowadays, those kids wanting to be all hip hop-ish. So it all has something to do with the veracity of those words to make those characters believable. Toni Morrison has characters that use vulgar words, that use perhaps a vernacular that is not that vernacular that Toni Morrison herself uses. If you watch any of her interviews, how she speaks and the cadence of her speech, the eloquence of her words, completely different. It is completely different than perhaps the language. It's different from the language that her characters use, the characters that she portrays. It all has something to do with veracity. I recently visited my mother in Brazil, and I brought home a lot of my old books. You can see how the pages are worn out. These are books that I've had since college. And there's a lot of this talk about Kindle and digitalizing everything, but I really like feeling the books and turning pages. Maybe one day I will completely go digital and never touch a book again. Maybe, or not. I don't know. I really like feeling the books. So what I meant to say was that a lot of the books that I brought home, this is a library book, but I have my own books that I brought home from when I was in college. I want to recreate the experience of being in college and learning literature from taking a course to become an English teacher. I want to recreate that experience to people who want to learn English as a foreign language or as a second language, or people that just like literature. These are the target audiences for the courses that I'll teach. So I will focus on language, using the language in the literature to teach language itself for people who belong to the groups of EFL, ESL, and the people who are native speakers of English can focus on the content and perhaps a little bit of the language as well. A lot of native speakers have very, very limited vocabulary, which surprises me sometimes. So those are the target audiences for what I'm doing. There will be literary analysis, there will be language focus, a little bit of, and by language I mean a little bit of grammar, a little bit of pronunciation. Some people say, "Oh, you have an accent. You have an accent. You're not pronouncing the words correctly." An accent is a particular cadence of somebody's speech and a particular way to pronounce words that gives away that person's nationality or that person's first language. When somebody who speaks French as their native language, if they speak French and when they start to speak English, if you can hear the French in their English, that's interference from their native language. That's an accent. But if you hear somebody speak and you don't know where they're from, and they just sound like their English sounds good enough that that you understand what they're saying, you have no problem understanding what they're saying. So they are intelligible speakers. That's not called an accent. That's called EIC, English for International Communication. Nowadays, you can be tested on it as well. I got a score of 945 out of 990 when I took that test, that exam for English for International Communication. And I've actually taught people skills to take that test. So pronunciation will be one of the focuses also. And there are different ways to pronounce words. And for you to say that somebody is mispronouncing a word, it has to be something that they pronounce it and you don't know what they're saying. As long as communication is promoted, they're not mispronouncing a word, even if it doesn't sound like the way the native speakers would say it. That's called linguistically acceptable language. So I will be including some of this as well. So this was basically just a little bit of, how do I put this? I just wanted to make sure that people understand the purposes of the archives that I'm creating for my channel.